that you don't want being recorded. All right, let's see. Rice, NWVSU gear too. All right. Tutor is here in WVSU gear. Michaela's here. Kenzie's here. Hodges is here in WVSU gear. Same as Midkiff. And Hudson is here too. So far, everybody's accounted for. See, 2 minutes left. Well, 1 and some change. I'll go ahead and start announcements. It is being recorded. Good morning. Asbury is here. Justin's here. Anyway, like I said, we're recording. We have less than 2 minutes left, so I'll go ahead and do some of the announcements. Less than 1 minute. For one thing, your lab report. I know for every one of you, well, almost there's a few exceptions, but for almost every one of you, the lab reports are past due. I'll go ahead and tell you now, I'm not going to grade them until finals week. So do whatever you need to do. Prioritize things the way you need to, whether you need to prioritize studying for the final or whatever it is, or some other class. I'm not going to start grading the lab exam or lab reports until Monday. And my suggestion, I highly recommend this, even if it seems overwhelming, at least just get it started. Get the thing started. Worry about getting it finished, start to finish, and then start adding details. I know that sounds weird, but just get some basics. Like make sure you just write something for the abstract, something for the introduction. You know, make sure you have something for each section. Just make sure something's on there and share it with me. And then go in once you have time and start filling in the details. Because it's more important to have, in this case, and I hate to do this, but I'm just trying to cut you guys a break. So it's more important to just have something turned in than the quality of how well it's written. Because, you know, if you have something turned in, you're not going to get a 0, even if it's garbage. If you have nothing turned in, you're going to get a 0, right? So do that. Any questions about the lab report? All right. Extra credit, another big extra credit opportunity. This pencil's reminded me. So Friday, either after class or the end, you're going to do student evaluations. You know, your turn to get back at me. But we're going to do it, like I said, towards the end of class. And I know that's on a Friday and it's at the end of class. So because of that, I'm going to offer everybody who stays back and does it 5 points of extra credit just to be here to give a student evaluation. Yeah. What else? So please spread the word. Obviously, there's only a few of you here. A lot of people who never come for some reason and don't show up online either. They really need the points, and they're not here to hear this, and they're probably not going to watch a video. So tell your friends, come to class on Friday, get these extra 5 points for filling out the student evaluation. The other reminder, again, the finals on Monday morning at 8 online. And if you want other arrangements, now's the time to tell me. If you want to do it some other day, or if you don't want to do it online, whatever the case may be, now's the time to tell me. And if you miss it, like one of you has missed all 3 of these exams, you will get a 0. So, you know, don't miss it. What else? And I will admit, the final will be a little bit harder in that there won't be any partial credit questions. You know, like, for example, the photosynthesis respiration exams. All the photosynthesis questions, there's only 2 correct answers. light reactions or Calvin cycle. And if you guessed any of those two, you always got partial credit. If you guessed any of the other garbage I threw out there to throw you off, you got 0 credit, right? But for the final, it won't be like that. Anyway, one last time for attendance, and then I'll tell a joke that AI wrote me, and then we'll get started. We have, let's see, Bowers is here in WVSU gear, and so is Massey. Anyway, yeah, so, oh yeah, the other thing, so sorry, I wrote this, but I know some of you don't read the announcements because some of you need points and don't reply back and say, hey, I read this announcement, can I have a free point? So I'm going to verbally say this, and again, please tell your friends because I'm probably preaching to the choir. There is a mistake in the syllabus. According to the syllabus, the due date for independent work is May 7th, and I have to stick by what the syllabus says. Therefore, you can still turn in papers until May 7th. Any questions about that? All right, so I asked AI to write me a joke about the end of the semester. I'll see if anybody can guess it. I really don't have time for this, but who cares, right? All right. Why did the college student bring a ladder to the last week of classes? Any guesses? To reach the end of the semester. That's AI for you. They can write a pretty decent biology paper I've seen, but it's not good at jokes. Anyway, let's jump into this.
Wait, what wrote biology?
Oh yeah, you see, you've got to read my announcements. This is why I'm being so picky.
I read your announcements.
Yeah.
How you did
Oh, I'm sorry, the Facebook.
Cheating.
Yeah, man. They, and I've seen people do it, and this is why I'm so picky. Like, if there's anything in your paper that's not covered by a source, I'm just not going to take your paper because I've done this with AI. I've written papers with AI, and it'll give me this great paper. But then, if I compare what it wrote to the sources that it gave me, some of the stuff in there is not in the source. Like, it's just came up with it. It might be true, but it wasn't substantiated by a source. So this is why, yeah, I'm being so picky, just so you guys know, because I have caught people cheating. So I'm not just being mean for the sake of being mean. People have been cheating. I've been catching them. Yes, sir. Do what? No, that's fine. That's a great question. What if you just know something, for example, right? Like I know, and this is great because somebody wrote a paper about one of these species. Cats are an invasive species, right? I know that. But if I'm going to write a paper, that's not, I have to substantiate that. So even though you know it, find a source to back it up, which is a great practice to have as a college-educated student or a person anyway, right? Once you graduate, you're supposed to be held to a higher standard as the other people. So hopefully you'll do that too. Just because you know something doesn't matter. Like back it up, right? So I know this, but according to this peer-reviewed source, these are facts. You know what I mean? Always back it up with facts. So great question. Anyway, let's jump into it. Back into chapter 19. The first word for attendance, because of AI, will be a dad joke. That was a decent dad joke, really. My kids hate dad jokes. My son does anyway. My daughters don't mind them. Anyway, here we go. Current side. We are in the third of 4 of the main bullet points. Again, I'm going to have to rush through it. So if you're taking notes, jot something down if you need to ask me a question later. Or if you need to, ask me a question now. But I'm going to go through this quickly. So remember, again, we're talking about the populations. We're looking at population growth and things that affect population growth, right? That's what this whole chapter is about, populations, right? A group of individuals of the same species that are interacting with each other. They're interbreeding with each other. They're dealing with the same things, fighting for the same resources, so on and so forth. So now that we've learned a lot about population ecology, we're going to talk about how population ecology is used. Like, how is this even useful outside of biology itself? So let's talk about it. This slide right here is just an introduction. There's going to be no questions about this on the exam. This is just introducing you to what we're about to talk about. Natural ecosystems, as you know or should know, have been converted to those that produce goods and services for our benefit. So, for example, especially in the Midwest, for like Iowa and Nebraska, that used to be a natural prairie, for example, and we've turned it into farms. Still an ecosystem, but it's a different ecosystem. It might look the same for a non-biological eye. You might look at a field of green here and then look at a field of green there and say, oh, it's a field of green, but it's very different. But anyway, with that in mind, your book points out the population ecology is used to increase the population of organisms we wish to harvest. So again, using corn as an example, right? We fertilize it We put herbicide down to kill all the other plants other than the corn. We put pesticide down to kill all the insects that want to eat it. And also, well, that goes with this next bullet point, we decrease the pest population, right? Do things to eliminate the things that are going to kill our crops. And of course, we save populations of organisms that are threatened with extinction. And we're going to talk about all three of these separately, but these two kind of go hand in hand, and that third one is kind of on its own. Anyway, any questions so far? Here we go. Let's jump into actual applications of population ecology. The first one we're going to talk about is conservation of endangered species. This is so common sense. It's right there in the name. And your book does give this example. Let me just go ahead and say right now and put it next to this name of this woodpecker, because I'm not going to specifically ask you about this woodpecker. This is just a great example of how it's complicated to conserve endangered species. It seems simple on paper, right? So this woodpecker is an endangered species, so it would make sense. The very simple thing to say is like, well, let's protect it, right? Pretty simple. Let's protect it. So like maybe let's say there's laws that say you're not allowed to kill them. Okay, that's an easy thing. Or then you can get even deeper and say, all right, you're also not allowed to disturb their nests. All right. Then you can get even a little bit deeper and say, okay, these are an endangered species, so let's make sure we don't destroy their habitat. And that's where things get a little bit tricky, and that's what we're talking about here. This is what your book uses as an example. These particular woodpeckers require a longleaf pine forest, right? So not just any pine forest. You might not know what longleaf pine forests are. It doesn't matter. It's just a particular type of pine. So this is a forest. It's primarily filled with those kind of pines as opposed to other trees. And they need them because they drill their nest holes in those pine trees, right? So they need those pine trees. You can't just take this red cocketed woodpecker and put it in a hardwood forest like we have in Kanawha State Forest, for example, right? It needs that particular kind of forest. So again, common sense would say, let's do everything we can to protect those forests, at least for the sake of preserving this endangered species. So what's happened instead is the reason it is endangered is because we basically just been destroying its habitat. We've been logging it, right, because we need wood. We've been cutting down the trees because we need to grow food for ourselves, right? That part's easy. This part, I think, is common sense. I mean, we have to do those things to survive. But obviously, common sense tells you if these birds are really picky about the forest they live in, then we need to preserve these forests, right? We need to protect them. That part's common sense. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. They've also lost habitat due to suppressing the fires, right? So fires have been starting in these forests, and we've been putting them out, right? Because, hey, we want to save this endangered species. But that's actually backfired. By putting out the fires, it's actually hurt these woodpeckers. Any guesses why? So this is, again, kind of counterintuitive. To me, you would think, oh, we need these forests, better not let them burn down. But it's the opposite. We've been putting out the fires, and it's been bad. Any guesses why? And I don't expect anybody to know this. I just want to see if anyone can guess. That would be a great guess, because yeah, sometimes there are a lot of things that, like, when things burn, sometimes there's other seeds that'll germinate that won't germinate until after fire. So that is a great guess. But in this case, it happens not to be it. But great guess. If I can remember, I'll give you extra credit for guessing. Not only for throwing out a guess, but one that does make sense. Here's the real reason. These breeding birds abandon their nests when the vegetation is thick and higher than about 15 feet. And I'm going to show you a picture that's make a lot more sense. And again, if you're taking notes, there's no need to write any of this down because this is just an example. I'm not going to ask you about these woodpeckers. So the reason that they need, the reason they abandon their nest when it's over 15 feet tall is because they require a clear flight path between trees, right? So for some reason, they can't fly high. They go from tree to tree. And obviously they can't fly through the brush. They need it to be clear. So again, if it gets too thick, they leave. So because of that, the critical habitat was protected with a maintenance program that included controlled fires to reduce the undergrowth. So in this case, it was actually beneficial to have the fires. So beneficial, in fact, that they started fires. I mean, they controlled them to make sure they didn't spread out of control, but they started fires. And then here's the picture of what we're talking about. There's a picture of the woodpecker right there. And then you can see on the top, this is what it looks like when there's not fires, right? Fires are a natural thing usually. So usually, generally speaking, when it comes to protecting the environment, doing things that are naturally happening is usually what's best. So this is what it looks like, when we don't suppress the fires. When we do suppress the fires. And it looks nice, it's nice and green, but this is actually what it's supposed to look like. Because in nature, there are supposed to be periodic fires, at least in that particular part of the world. So again, you can see this bird will have problems flying around down here because it's too thick. But here, after the fire, there's plenty of places to fly. So again, I'm not going to ask you questions about these woodpeckers on the exam, but this is a great example of how it is important, I guess not necessarily for you guys, but for somebody in the world to understand population ecology, because this is very counterintuitive, right? We want to protect this endangered bird, and by doing that, we want to protect the habitat. And common sense tells you to protect them, put out the fires, right? But sometimes common sense is incorrect, right? So this is why it's important that people study these species. So whenever you see somebody complaining on the news that like, oh, the federal government just paid for another study where some scientist, studied some particular species, people like to complain about that kind of stuff. Well, it's useful. You might not get it. I might not get it sometimes, but there's usually a reason for these studies. Somebody figured that out. Anyway, any questions about that example? All right, the next word for attendance then, I'm going to underline it instead of saying it. There it is. All right. So again, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about saving endangered species. The point your book is trying to make is it's not as easy as it seems, right? It's not as easy as saying, hey, those are endangered, don't kill them. All right, let's talk about sustainable resource management. I might ask this question. According to the logistic growth, so remember, let me draw this on the map or on a graph. Right now I'm drawing exponential growth. The population growth is exploding and then it starts evening out. And at this point now I'm drawing logistic growth. This point right here where the population stops growing is called carrying capacity. And you've already learned this on Monday. So this is just an example or just a reminder. That's logistic growth. That's carrying capacity. That's the highest number that the environment can sustain. Anyway, according to logistic growth, the fastest growth occurs when the population is at 1/2 carrying capacity. So right here, this is the sweet spot. This is when the population is growing the quickest. Anytime before that, it's growing slower. Anytime after that, it's growing slower. So that is the sweet spot. So theoretically, the best results are achieved by harvesting the population down to this level. So again, we're talking about sustainable resource management. In other words, the people or the entities that are in charge of saying, all right, you're allowed to harvest this many deer in West Virginia this year, or you Alaskan crabbers are allowed to catch this many Dungeness crabs this year, right? Anybody who's making these laws and regulations that's determining how many you can grow, that's the sweet spot they're trying to hit. It's not just some magic number or just some random number that they're picking, right? They're picking this number for a reason. However, the logistic model, which is this right here, assumes that the growth rate and the carrying capacity are stable over time. So if you remember, one of the last things we talked about yesterday was that's the model. But remember, there was the picture of the fur seals, and then there's actual dots that showed the actual data. So the dots were like close to the line, sometimes on the line, but they're very rarely on the line. They were just always like close to the line. I don't know if you guys remember that. The point here is, it's a model. It doesn't always fit. The data doesn't always fit the model. So because of that, hitting this sweet spot is sometimes hard to do. It can be tricky. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click that link and watch a little video that helps explain this a little bit better than I am because I'm rushing it, and that'll talk about it a little bit longer. But your book uses fish as an example. It's the only wild animal that's still hunted at large scale. I'm not going to ask you that. Actually, I'm not going to ask you anything about this. This is just an example. I think there are questions about this on the study guide, but there won't be on the exam because it's just an example. Anyway, they're talking about the North Atlantic cod fisheries. So this is a real thing that actually happened. It's a great example. What happened was, again, they were trying to hit that sweet spot, but they estimated, whoever was in charge of this, estimated the population to be too high. So again, let me draw this again. You're trying to hit that sweet spot, right? So if you think the population is here and you try to get it down to here, right, however many that is, but if you were wrong and the population was actually here and you still try to reduce it by the same number, then you're going to go too low. Does that make sense? They're trying to reduce it by X number of fish because they thought it was at a certain number, but it turns out it wasn't at that number. They overestimated it. So that was part of the problem. The other part of the problem was the fishermen had this practice of discarding young cod that were not legal size at the sea. And little did they know that actually caused a higher mortality rate than predicted. So the common sense would tell you, oh, if you catch a fish and it's too small, just throw it back, it'll be okay. Turns out with this particular in this particular situation, it wasn't as okay as we thought, right? So we didn't know that. I shouldn't say we, but whoever was in charge of this. So because of these reasons, the fishery collapsed in 1992 and it still hasn't recovered. Now that's a pretty big deal. For you guys, probably don't care, but that would be probably tantamount to somebody saying, you know, of course this wouldn't happen, but if something just happened in West Virginia and then all of a sudden one year, boom, no one's taking coal out of the ground. You guys would flip your lids if you're from here, right? Coal's almighty coal. Same thing here, right? This was their bread and butter. That was their industry. And then all of a sudden it just collapsed due to being mismanaged. So imagine if somebody just said, like, next year, sorry, we're done with coal forever. People would flip out. Well, same thing here. And again, the point your book is trying to make basically is it's sustainable resource management. You know, the people, first of all, this is why we have rules about this is how many you can catch. This is what size they need to be. This is when you can catch them. This is when you can't catch them. This is because we need this for survival, because if we don't, we're going to ruin our food supply, right? So we have to do this sustainably. And the point that your book is trying to make here is that it's not just as easy as saying, all right, well, we just need to hit that sweet spot and that's it, right? We need people to understand these things and to do the research and to understand these populations, because without understanding the populations, you're going to make these mistakes and it could be disastrous. Anyway, there's a graph showing what we're talking about. So this shows how many fish they caught over the years, starting from about 1960 until it collapsed in the 90s. So again, that's a big deal. It might not sound like a big deal to you because, one, you might not eat fish, so you might think, oh, who cares? And also, obviously, you can get fish from other places. But again, that was their coal mining industry, right? So there's a bunch of people there who just lost everything. All the fishermen, all the businesses that are getting supported by the fishermen. Again, just like losing WVU losing, or excuse me, West Virginia losing the coal industry. Anyway, any questions about this? Okay, that's the next word for attendance. Fish. We won't even do North Atlantic cod, just fish is the next word for attendance. Anyway, this kind of, some of what I just said is here again, but in writing, sustainable catch rates cannot be estimated without knowing life history traits. So all that stuff I talked to you about on Monday, it's important. Not necessarily for you guys, right? Because all but one of you are not biology majors, so you probably never use this again. But now you understand why we have fishing license and why we have things like the DNR and why we have laws and why we pay scientists to study these things, because it literally does protect industries. And like I said on Monday, or maybe it was Friday, it is literally a matter of life and death, because if we don't have food, we die. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a matter of imminent life and death. Like if we don't start figuring this out, we're going to die in 2 weeks, which a lot of people will try to scare you that way. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just saying that's why this is important, because eventually it could kill us if we don't do things correctly. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Obviously, there's no test questions on there. This is kind of summing up everything we just talked about regarding sustainable resource management. Next one we're talking about is invasive species. I've already talked about this in chapter 20 briefly. It's also very simple to understand, so we're going to go through it quickly. I already gave you my example of the dead mice they drop out of helicopters in Guam. And if you want, you can look up other examples, because there's some really wacky examples. Maybe not as wacky as the one I give about the dead mice being dropped out of helicopters in Guam, but there's still some pretty wacky ones. Anyway, what is an invasive species? You need to know that for the exam. It's an organism that is introduced to a non-native habitat that has a devastating effect on the ecosystem. So, right, those two things. It has to be non-native, and it has to be significantly bad for the ecosystem. And I use this example the first time we talked about invasive species. If you introduce an alligator to a river in Alaska, that's not going to be an invasive species. Yes, it's non-native, but it's going to die really quickly, right? That's way out of its area. It's going to die. It can't live there. Now, if you introduce a cat into a place that has a lot of endangered birds, like Wake Island, off the coast or in the middle of the Pacific, that is an invasive species. because they're non-native and they're causing a lot of harm. As a matter of fact, you can look that up for independent work. That's another place I've been to, Wake Island. It had a lot of crazy birds that you couldn't, like endemic birds, right? They need that spot. It's a very small island in the Pacific. And the U.S. government paid money to eradicate all the cats on that island because they were killing endangered birds. Anyway, that's basically what you need to know for the exam. Again, non-native and causes harm. Now, if you want to look into this for independent work, or if you download this PowerPoint and click any of these pictures, each one of those will take you to a video. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but this is, again, another fun example of an invasive species, I think. Well, they're always horrible, but this one's at least interesting. Does anybody know what these are? I mean, they're fish, but does anybody know what kind of fish they are? Good guess. They're called Asian carp, if you want to look into it. What happens is the sound of motors, and they're not from these rivers, the sound of engines gets them crazy, and they start jumping out of the water. So people, this is what this is a picture of, people just getting hit by flying fish. They're trying to drive the boats, they get crazy, they jump up, but people have been injured. This person's making the best of it. He's got some protective gear. He's going water skiing. He's trying to catch them with his net and then dunk them through the other net and into the bucket. But yeah, look up Asian carps if you're interested in it. They the Midwest, I think that might be the Missouri River. As a matter of fact, another good reason to look it up for independent work if you want, because they are invasive, so they spread, right? So I don't know exactly where they are anymore. It's
How injured are you talking? Who get knocked out like that?
yeah. Depending on how fast they go, and if you hit them just right.
Yeah.
Anyway, any questions about invasive species in general? All right. Sorry. I was just focusing on the interesting stuff. Let me tell you this really quickly before we move. The reason this is important is because they're non